I think it has started recording. Yeah.
It's a little less distracting.
No, I mean, that was cool. I liked it a lot. So.
Okay, so we'll start off here. I sent out did you look at the position that or the description that I sent out?
Yeah, I did look
Okay.
at it, and so I had some doubts regarding the entire description of the job as well. So,
Mhm.
uh, I mean, is it fine if I ask a few questions? And to come clean, this is my first interview ever, so
Yeah,
like
no
I
worries.
haven't, I have,
This is the whole point, right? So the
yeah,
first thing is that being your first interview, it can be kind of daunting, but this is a mock
yeah.
interview. I'll treat this as like natural interview just so that you have the full experience.
Mhm.
So just try not to be nervous, and try, answer as much as you can, and we'll go over everything. But the best way to do this is that to give you kind of little preparation, but not too much, so that you have this kind of like, um, you know, that this feels like a regular interview would, right? Because since we never met, we're
Yeah.
strangers, it would be like that. So uh, before we start though, do you have any questions you want to ask? And then we'll just jump on along, and then we'll go with it, and you see it's not as bad as you think.
I just had a question regarding the job role in general. So,
Hmm.
if like the job role states that it's a Java developer role, right? And there
Hmm.
is also a little bit of JavaScript and like a familiarity with JavaScript frameworks. So I'm fine with the latter half of the job role, but the
Hmm.
first part, in like in an interview also, should I like come clean beforehand, like, hey, I the last experience I had with Java is in like my high school, and I refrain from putting that in my resume as well, because I honestly can't do coding in Java. So is this something that I
So
should say beforehand? Yeah, sorry, go on.
no, I mean that's a good question. So it depends. So when you're applying for a job, right, you shouldn't use your resume
Hmm.
for every single job. You want to
Yeah.
tailor your resume specific to that whatever that job may be, right? So um, yes, you can say you can, when you list skills, you can say that you know Java, but you haven't used it professionally. There's nothing wrong with that. Just so you know a little bit
Hmm.
of me. I work for Ferguson Enterprises. So I've been working for Ferguson for about 6.5 years. When I
Hmm.
started, I had no Java experience. The only Java experience I had was in college.
Hmm.
But the whole point of it is that as a software engineer, the language isn't the biggest hurdle. The
Yeah.
language is just a language, it's syntax. I mean, you can go over on Google and figure out syntax. The most important part of any software engineering is actual how your thought process, how you go around on finding solutions, how you interact with other people, all those things. Those are more important than you knowing the language.
Okay.
Just because you don't know the language, I mean, you also don't want to hide it, because
Yeah.
if I see a resume and you say you know Java, I'm gonna ask you Java questions.
Yeah.
But if you tell me you don't have Java but you know object oriented, I'll ask
Hmm.
you object oriented questions. You know, but there's a difference between knowing a language, and I don't care if you know the language or not. To be honest, like again, language you can easily pick up. What's
Hmm.
more important is how well is your fundamentals. So
Okay.
that's the key difference. So no, it's not that big of a deal if you apply for a job that you don't know the language, so long as you can show that you have the fundamentals and you have, and give me a reason why I should hire you, right?
Okay.
So essentially, it's not about being the perfect candidate with every single qualification. It's like standing out as why I should hire you. And one other thing you should also remember, interview goes both ways,
Hmm.
which means, yes, I'm interviewing you to see if you're a candidate, but you also should be interviewing me if this is a company you want to work for.
Hmm.
Because just because you see a job description doesn't mean you may want to work there. It may be a potential that you want to work there, but treat it as if like you want to have questions. So on this interview, I'm going to expect you to have questions for me when I ask you, just so that way you can have that little bit, and then we'll go from there. Sounds good?
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, perfect. So we'll start off, and then we'll see. So, well, hi, Siddhant. Thank you for joining me today. I'm glad that you applied for this position. So let's start. Okay. So give me a little bit of background on yourself.
Yeah, so as you already know, my name is Siddhant, and I'm a Master of Computer Science student at UC Irvine. I completed my undergrads from India, and I majored in computer science as well. And so basically, in regards to my experience, I have interned at Volkswagen as a software developer. So majorly, I was involved in the front end development part in Volkswagen, and I have been comfortable with using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and React. So on that, in Volkswagen, I was also involved in how do you say, like, designing the web pages as well, not just coding it. So the first half of my internship experience was I was very much involved in using tools like the designing tools such as Adobe XD, Figma, Sketch, where I design UI pages and UI components. And the later half, I was switched to a more developmental based role where I used mainly JavaScript and React to, in short, develop the components which are designed. And later on, I also had a small 3 month experience in a company called BizDoc. So I don't think the company exists anymore, but yeah. So my experience over there was also of that of a UI developer. And over there, unfortunately, I didn't get much chance to use JavaScript or React, or it was basic HTML and CSS. And so the whole task which I was provided was to design LMS, a lead management system, and then come up with the front end for that, like the front end code with that. So since it was like my first internship experience and I was very new to the entire front end field, I only used mainly HTML and CSS for that. And currently, right now, I'm working as a, like, not per se a front end developer, but as a software developer in general. And I'm also using some of NLP algorithms and everything on campus itself. So there is this research lab called UCI Applied Innovation Center. So I'm hired there as a software developer, or technically a graduate student researcher, but my role is that of a software developer. And yeah, that's all about me.
So what's the current stack that you're working on?
So right now, it's kind of, I have a freedom to work on what I want. So I'm trying to explore more in JavaScript and React because that's the tech stack I've used before, like more than the others. And I'm trying to get in more in depth of basically the React framework and also trying to pick up some Tailwind CSS in general. And for the algorithms practice and everything, I'm working on Python. So in job perspective, I'm right now using Python and JavaScript.
So Python for the backend?
Yeah, and for the
Okay.
machine learning codes and everything. So.
Oh, you also do machine learning. Okay, that's a good one to highlight too.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask questions too?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, related to the
Yeah.
answers I give, right? Right. Okay. So when you ask me about my how do you say this? My background, is
Mhm.
it like I answered just on based of what I do and more catered towards my academics rather than in general? So was this like a decent answer, or should I start to include more of university experience as well?
I mean, you don't want to, like, again, so when you apply for interview, I'm gonna have your resume in front of me, right? So I would want to have an experience, understand what isn't on the actual resume, and more
Mm-hmm.
specifically would be like your experience in the projects. Like, the more that you can give me that it's not on the paper, the best
Mm-hmm.
it is. So one of the questions that I will ask you, you know, is one of fundamental questions, and I'll ask you now so they could answer it. So, uh, tell me one of your experience or the hardest problem you faced and how you solved it.
Okay. So one of the hardest problems I've faced is a very recent one. So I'm working currently under a professor in UC Irvine itself, and my task was to debug a very huge and extensive code written by a group of developers. So the group which the professor leads had a tie-up with another company from back from China, and they wrote an extensive capture the flag code for a DEF CON event which happens in Vegas. So my task was to basically reverse engineer and try to figure out the code in general. So that turned out to be really hard for me because, as I mentioned, it. I mean, first things, I wasn't that experienced in handling huge lines of code or like where you, and it was just me in general. So the first step I took in was try to figure out as much as possible from the code. I try to figure out the API calls. I try to figure out what is rendering, which part of the code is rendering what part of the application, and which part is calling which another whole separate part of the code. So I got that in my basics. So basically, I figured that out. I had that in theory, but to make it run and everything, I required some assistance from people who already had such experience. So my first step, as I mentioned, was to go through the code and find out what I can for myself. Then the next step was to present it to the professor and be clear about what is there and what is not. So in general, I just asked for more assistance and some more clarification regarding to the problems which I faced. So it turns out it was a very good thing to do because now I have another teammate with me who has some knowledge in like Dockerization and AWS as well, which was one of the main problems which was bugging me. So now we have made some very good progress in them. So, yes.
So, as a technical challenge, what was actually technical that you ran into while you're working on this problem?
So the main technical challenge was so the platform, like the application, is built using Docker, and I wasn't that familiar with how the containers and snapshots work. So it took me a while to try and figure out how exactly the entire, like how an application is hosted using Docker. So that was the main technical problem I faced, and with assistance from a new member and a new perspective, that helped me solve it and also understand and learn a new thing about Docker. Yeah.
Got it. So how familiar are you with Docker?
Not really, because right now I just have tapped the basic surface of Docker because I didn't really thought to use Docker or integrate Docker in one of my own projects. So this is the first time I'm getting some experience with Docker. So right now I'm just getting clear with the theoretical part and trying to understand what exactly goes on.
Okay. So explain to me as much as you do understand about Docker then.
Okay, so from what I understand, it is used to host an application, not exactly host, but like have the application ready so that it can be used to run on any server possible. So not exactly the entire code has to be transported or I don't know how shifted to an entire next server. So Docker helps with that. So Docker basically, I think you containerize your part of the code which can then be accessed by people or like whoever wants to run it on their own PC, they can just use the Docker containers to run that instead of downloading the entire source code on their own server or on their own laptop. I think that's the basic general use of Docker right now, from what I understand.
Okay. What does it mean to containerize?
Um, so I think I'm not really sure about this. I wouldn't want to just say something because I'm not really clear about this at this point.
Okay. So just a little feedback. Good answers. And it's fine if you don't know. It's good to say that. Sometimes though you want to try to say like if you can, anything like that. Just so you know, I'm pretty familiar with Docker. Not too familiar, but I've used it before. But so it's one of those things that it's helpful for you to actually understand and learn about too. Just to give you an example, Docker is more like a virtualization of any type of server. It's an environment. So, before back in the days, you'll need to actually have a computer, a separate server just to run SQL Server or a Linux server. Just even if you want to just host a simple website, right? You would have to run like nowadays. Back when I was doing PHP, that's what I started with. We used WAMP, right? Windows Apache, MySQL, PHP. So that was it's a whole environment all in the one system, which you could run in Windows, so that you could host websites, run PHP, all that stuff. Docker allows you to do just that, run a specific container that may have an application, like you said, or a server. So one of the things you may or may not have used is that you can actually download Microsoft SQL containers, images, and run that in Docker. So if you ever need to, like, say you want to have a web app, right, that you want to talk to a database, you could have Docker run that database for you, and you could connect and communicate and store information. And then you can even use like a tool to connect to that SQL server to actually retrieve data out of that.
That's very cool. So you don't need to have the SQL database in person, right? So it's there already on the
Well,
Docker once you
technically it is in person because that Docker image is running it. So it's have you ever heard of like virtualization
Mm-hmm.
when you have virtual machines?
Yeah.
So Docker's a way to run locally and very efficiently a virtual machine of whatever server you want to run. That's what's
Okay.
so great about it. So it's actually you virtually having a physical machine separate from your actual instance. You can even connect the network information between the containers and stuff and run your apps. And it's, it also allows you to potentially like local development, let's say, if you're working for a bigger company, and instead of
Mm-hmm.
connecting over a VPN to have access to a server, like a database server, you could actually have a Docker instance that has a sample data, so you can actually work offline without having to be online every time.
That's
So
very
it's a
cool.
great tool. Yeah.
So I have another follow-up question in
Mhm.
regards to this only. So from what I understand, if you make changes locally, you cannot, those are not reflected in Docker, right? Because the code which is in
Not
Docker
true.
serves as a
Not true.
snapshot.
You can make changes in Docker itself. It doesn't mean, so it depends what you're running in Docker.
Uh-huh.
And that's actually the proper answer. It's not like you wouldn't make any changes. Is that it depends what you're running in Docker. You can run a whole app in Docker. So if you change that app and you put it in a Docker container, it will have those changes in there. But if you're using Docker as like so you mentioned API calls, right? If you have
Mm-hmm.
your local application and you are sending API calls to Docker, right? That could be making changes on a database, or that could be just providing you information via the API point. Depends what that API endpoint is doing. So
Okay.
it's more about having a like a to me, I always think it's like it may not be correct. Again, I don't use Docker proficiently. I've used it in a couple of my projects, but it's great because it can emulate those kind of things. Like we've used Docker to run Rabbit instances, Redis instances, stuff like that, because it's very
Mm-hmm.
easy and convenient. Not to mention, if you're on a Windows, not a Unix machine, right? It's those systems don't run very efficiently, or you don't have to install it. So you could just run a Docker environment to do it for you.
Okay.
So it allows for local development. So, okay,
That's very cool.
great. So how do you feel about that question?
Yeah, so in regards to the question in general, I had another, like you mentioned
Mhm.
that if you don't really know the answer, so what should I exactly say? So like for example, I didn't exactly know what a container is, and
Mhm.
so I have this feeling, like from what I've heard and read, it's like if you answer just to answer and say something wrong, that's more wrong than not saying something. I just
It
want
depends. It
feedback on
depends.
that.
I mean, you being honest, saying I'm not very familiar with Docker or how containers work, but this is how I've used it. You see, you don't
Okay.
have to say you know exactly what it is. You can explain how you've used that technology or how you've understood it, right? And leading off saying like you're not an expert, because obviously, but the thing is that in your resume, that stuff will be listed. So it's not like it's gonna be like,
Mhm.
I'm not saying like you lie. You're not saying like extensively, because if you say you do and I ask you a question and you can't answer it, that's very evident, right? So you want to be
Yeah.
pretty honest about it. But at the same time, again, when you walk into an interview, it depends on who you're interviewing with, right? So currently the way that we do hiring, there's 3 interview steps. The first you talk to the hiring manager, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they get a feel of like, are you gonna, mesh well with the team? Do you have enough like experience? Do you know enough about things that we want to move you to the technical interview? And
Mm-hmm.
then when you go to technical interview, that's when you get bombarded with technical questions. And
Mm-hmm.
you should know the difference between interview and a technical interview. In a technical interview, you want to give as many technical answers as possible. So when I asked you what your hardest problem with, and you came back with, oh, it's because it was a huge code base, right? That's just volume, right? That's why I asked you more specifically, in that specific challenge that you faced, what was the technical challenge, right? And you specifically said, oh, I never used Docker, which is perfect. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's a great way, and how you solve that solution. Now, as you have more career experience, you're gonna have more complicated technical actual challenges that you could use, but that's a great way of doing that. So when they ask you for technical stuff, you want to think about where in your experience have you run into a software engineering challenge or a technical challenge that you need to overcome, and how you overcame. So that's the great way. Because the thing is, we're not always looking for you to have the perfect answer. And and for me, at least, when I hire people, we're looking for how you solve problems. Because the software engineer is not about knowing the language. It's more about how you tackle problems and how you actually communicate. You know, those are the more important things. Now, not everybody will be that way. You know, in some technical interviews, you actually take a test or write an application. I'm not very good at those things, and I'm not a good test taker. But if you actually ask me questions and try to, know me a little bit more, I can excel on those. Those are the places where I can actually do that. So you need to find out what you're comfortable with and you're not comfortable, and the stuff you're not comfortable with, figure out how to, change it so that it becomes kind of like your asset. Even though you have like you said, you don't know very Docker, but I'm willing to learn. But this is how much I've learned about it. This is how I've used it and how I think of it. Even if you're wrong, that doesn't mean that that's bad. That just means your current understanding of it. It doesn't mean that's your whole understanding, because you're still learning about it. Okay?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
Great. All right, so we'll continue on. Let's see. So as you said, you don't have very much Java experience. You have JavaScript experience, and you've used Python. Do you prefer front end or back end as a developer, and why?
I do prefer front end developer. Before I answer, should I answer first and then I can ask my question?
You can ask your question if you want.
Yeah. So when you ask this question, like which part of the like front end or back end, so do you expect a technical answer? Like, because like it's kind of hard to answer this technically, or do you expect
No,
like
that's actually more I'm trying to understand more, where are you more like, what are you more comfortable with and why? So, because so the job descriptions have full stack, and full stack it's kind of hard to be a full stack engineer and knowing both front end and back end. But the thing is that I asked you more in order to get a feel of like, what are you more comfortable with? What do you have more experience with? Because then I can then tweak my questions towards that kind of either it's front end related or back end related.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Should I go ahead and answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I prefer the front end development side more because, as I mentioned before, the very first experience, like a professional experience I had, was that of a UI designer, and so things basically just started to flow naturally from that point. Because once I started designing the components and everything which were supposed to be used in an actual application, it just made more sense to me to make it possible using code, and that's how I started with HTML and basic HTML and CSS to start developing my own designs. And after that, to make it more dynamic and to make it more interactive, I started to dabble into JavaScript, and that is how I was also introduced to React. So it basically felt like it was like a common basic flow, I would say. So for me, I think since I started as a UI designer, it just made more sense to me to become a front end developer, more focused on front end development. And yeah, that is the main reason I would prefer front end development.
So as a front end developer, what do you think is your biggest challenge when developing for that?
I think the biggest challenge is not how do you say, is making the things functional. So if there is like a pagination or like an on-click event which is supposed to happen, I think the main part is to get that component working as it's supposed to be, rather than making it look how it's supposed to be. So I think the main thing for a front-end developer is to understand that the functionality matters more over the design first. And once you have the functionalities written and it's working like how it's supposed to, and it's well connected with the backend, it's getting the data which is it's supposed to render, then you can go ahead and work on the UI part of it.
Got it. Very cool. Okay. Let's see. So are you familiar with object-oriented design or object-oriented languages?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Let me give you and have you worked with databases before, and what kind?
So yeah, I have worked with databases before, and mostly I've worked with SQL databases. And during one of my projects in undergrad, I have worked with like MongoDB database as well. So, but yeah, I mean, I have worked with databases.
What's the difference between SQL Server and MongoDB?
So I know this one. Yeah, so SQL and NoSQL, right? So a SQL server, you can have more joins and connections with others. So you can have a more logical database, I guess, which if a data is related to another table or another data itself, so that it makes more sense to use a SQL database. And if data is more broken, I guess that's when you use a NoSQL database.
How
I'm not.
how do you define broken data?
It's like if the data is not that related to each other, I think that's how I would define a broken database. So if it's just like individual retrievals and everything, that's when you prefer a NoSQL database because it's way more faster, I guess. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So just to give you a little bit of feedback, SQL Server and NoSQL servers, one of the biggest advantages for NoSQL is that you can have large data sets, not technically relational wise, to be very fast to be pulled out, right? But what's interesting is that you can store data both in a NoSQL or SQL server. We actually do that. We actually leverage MongoDB as more of a caching database than we do as a transactional database. But the backing of that means that it's SQL. So yeah, so I would advise on if you're gonna speak to like MongoDB and SQL, do a little bit more research on SQL Server or relational database and non-relational databases that way to have a more defined answer for that.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's great that you have MongoDB experience and SQL Server experience. And SQL Server roughly translate to MySQL also, and you find this out in your career, which is great. So one thing about the front end that you didn't really touch upon, and this might be just because, again, not having too much experience. One of the biggest challenges of front end design that I found is as you said, like functionality is great and that is very important, but you'll find out that design is also extremely important, and sometimes pixel perfect design is very perfect. But the biggest challenge is the fact that people have multiple browsers and multiple versions, right? And sometimes you have to support all of them, figure out those bugs. So my biggest challenge working on front end has always been the fact that just because you have a design that you received, you then have to troubleshoot and ensure that all of those design elements work the same exact way in multiple browsers and multiple versions. And being ahead of the fact that you understand how those how those components interact with each other in different browsers to understand why is it different in different browsers. So if you want to focus more on front end, that's one of those things that I would advise you is understanding how some of these browsers render, because different browsers between Mozilla, Firefox, Safari, and any other browsers out there, they'll have slight differences on rendering. Sometimes it's bigger than you expect to, and yeah, so that's for me is one of the biggest challenges in front end, is the fact that you have to keep up to date with the different browsers, not to mention versions, because you find it very rare where you get in a front end position where they're like, oh, you just need to worry about FileZilla X version or the latest version. You end up having to deal, because most customers use many different browsers, right? And I guess now it's not Internet Explorer, Edge, right? So there's Edge, Mozilla, Firefox, Safari, right? So, and you have different different operating systems, stuff like that. So that's a very large challenge, and that's good to bring up too, because people understand that being one of them.
So in regards to this, I also had another question. Do you think I should also like incorporate the responsive design thing as well to make the
Yeah,
components
responsive
responsive?
design, responsive is a big thing in front end. So it's good to touch upon that if you get asked, or if you happen to be answering anything front end related that you have worked with. Making it responsive is because nowadays, as you know, people aren't just browsing web pages via computers or laptops. You have tablets and phones are small enough that a bad experience, it could be a great experience on a desktop, but a very bad experience on the phone, because there's a couple of things on the phone. It's a smaller square space, you don't have that much real estate to deal with. And then the other thing is you also don't have a mouse to hover over things. So your kind of design elements have to be very different, and sometimes it has to work for both. Sometimes you don't. Some company would say, you know what, we only care about mobile. We don't care about the PC experience. And others will say, we care more about the PC experience than mobile, or they care for both. So it really depends on what the company is expecting or how they do business.
Okay.
So let's see. Okay, so you have that. Do you know what a monolith is? And can you describe and define it?
I'm sorry, what? A monolith?
Monolith? A monolith.
No, I think I'm hearing the term for the first time.
Okay, no worries. So monolith is what people usually talk about when you have a very large application that hasn't been broken apart like microservices.
Okay.
Have you heard of microservices?
I mean, I have heard about it, but I'm not sure in what terms. Like,
Okay,
I have
no worries.
definitely heard. Yeah.
So microservices, when you have small applications, broken apart based on like domain properties. So that way they only do work on their responsible domain, right? And you have many of these services that interact with each other, which would then give you an application that can do a lot, right? Monolith is the reverse of that. Monolith is when instead of having different parts of the code, dealing with its own responsibilities, when you have a large piece of code doing everything.
So is it like, just to put in terms, is it like having one single file to do every function there is, or is it
No,
have...
it's more about having this deals more when you have a very large application. So let me give you an example. So for my company, I manage the data set for the catalog for our e-commerce website. So my team is responsible for the internal tools we use in order to maintain and add new products and product data. But that also means that, I don't know if you know how e-commerce works, but the e-commerce site has the website, has the database, and the database can drive both the catalog, which is the product information, but it also has the more important part, which is the transactional stuff, all your orders, all that information is there. Now, there's ways that you could separate the application where you can have, the front end, the request, the back end, some information, but then the back end itself can be broken apart into like its different areas of its work. That's when you get close to microservices, because essentially is that you have a very tiny application that does one thing, but it does very well. Not one thing, but like, does little parts of the entire thing very well, and you talk to it, right? It's separate entity. So that way, if you need to make changes, you make changes here and you deal with that. In a monolith, everything is encompassed in a very big application, which is what we currently have to deal with, because my company has been around since early 2000s. And, as you know, back then, you don't have resources because it was a startup. So you create this app, and that's what you work with. Most of the time, you probably end up in monoliths, just because that's how most companies work with. Unless you start if you not unless, but most likely if you work on a startup, chances are you have more bleeding edge kind of technology and kind of like paradigms. So you probably run into microservice, but that's not always the case. You can have companies that does both.
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is good for me because, like, I have never heard of a monolith before. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I've had 18 years of experience in this career, right? So it's unfair for me to expect you to know those things, but that's why. And also the job application I put out there is just easier for me because that's what I've used, and that's for a more senior position. And again, don't worry about applying for a senior position, because Azure, that's the only way for you to get, higher positions, right? You may be able to get it within the company you're working on and get hired on, but in other places you have to show that you want, and that you can have the capability of becoming that, and that can get you through the door. They may be like kind of not sure that you have that, skill or experience level, but if you show that you're ready to learn, you really work hard, you can overcome that. But remember, interviews are both ways. You should always ensure that this is also the place you want to work for. It's hard when it's your first job and you're trying to do your first interview, because you want to have a paying gig so you can pay the bills. But keep that in mind, because sometimes you may not realize this, but the work environment is also very important for yourself, because not just the fact that you want to be able to work that, but mentally it's also you got to make sure that it's not mentally stressing you out, because both physically also, but mentally, because just because it's a mental kind of like drain, it doesn't mean that it's not important, because that will have tolls into your body, even physically, after a while. If you get stressed out for a very long time, you see those signs show up physically. So you want to make sure that the job that you're going for will be both physically acceptable and mentally acceptable to you. And sometimes it is draining because it's very hard and you're learning a lot, which is great. But you want to make sure that that's what you're looking for.
Okay. Yeah. I had just a follow-up question. So since you mentioned like applying to senior roles as well, I mean, senior roles aside, there are some entry-level jobs as well in which they have mentioned like you require at least 2 to 3 years of work experience. So what do you think I should do in that case? Because like I have come directly after my undergrads from India, and so the only work experience, I don't think I'm not sure if internship experience counts as work experience, but yeah. So like if it doesn't, I have no work experience in regards to like the professional manner. So do you think it's feasible for me to apply for job openings that require like 2 to 3 years of work experience?
I mean, I would still do it, because here's the thing. Just because they say work experience, it's very hard to kind of like discern between internship experience and actual work experience, because it's more about the quality and not the quantity, right? Even if you don't have the 2-3 years of like professional work experience, if you can show them that based on your internship, or even if it's like a volunteer kind of work experience, and you can show that in those positions you can show that you did almost the same type of work, if not more work, as a regular job or a professional experience, you can convince people that that's just enough. Because again, when we're looking about experience and we say 5 years, it's just so that we get a level of understanding and experience going there. It's not that, oh, you need to show specifically that you worked at the minimum 24 months of experience. It's more about what have you done in that 24 months? What was those 2 years about? Like, what did you learn? How have you learned it? And what are the challenges you ran into? So just because you don't have the full 2 years, it doesn't mean you shouldn't apply, but be ready for them to ask you that question of why did you apply for this? And then you have to have a very good answer, so make sure that you and you can even lead off, I don't have the 2 or 3 years worth of, professional experience when you're applying, but you can tell them like, I've done this in this internship, or I've done this on my personal time. There's many other different ways of actually showing experience without having to be an actual professional work experience for it to count. Because remember, it's not, and plus you could have been working professionally at a, whatever company, but what if all you did that was data entry? Because that's what they needed, right? So there's no way for anybody to specifically say that you need professional experience to like fulfill that requirement. It really depends on what type of experience you got and how well can you detail that. And obviously, and again, it could be just volunteer, but for a volunteer, if you were working for a non-for-profit, but you created a very complex app and you can, explain what you did and how you worked on it, even though you weren't paid, if that's actual experience, that's still a very acceptable answer. And then they'll ask you questions about that, again, most likely technical questions, stuff like that, and how you resolve that. And if you could answer that properly, it won't matter. It doesn't matter that it wasn't paid. It all matters is just about the quality of the experience.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm bombarding you with questions.
That's fine.
Because yeah. So I just also wanted to, you mentioned quality over the quantity, right? So I've heard like recently, so right now I'm working on building up my resume and starting to apply to jobs, right? Because I'll be graduating in December, and since I'm an international student, to continue working over in the United States, I will require a job in the next 6 months. So what my question is, to make my resume or my application more, how do you say, like sound reasonable enough, is it like I've heard that there should be no gaps in your resume, but if a recent project has not contributed much value, as you mentioned, if it's basically just like a data entry or like not that important of a task which I have done, but my previous experience, which was like maybe 2 years back, that has more value and more learning experience for me, and more complicated tasks have been performed during that. Which one do you think I should include in the resume?
I mean, you should include whatever is tailor-made for that position you're applying. So
Okay.
even if it's, 2 years ago, and to be honest, like, yeah, you may have a gap, but you've been in school, right? That's a very, very reasonable answer. And just because you have a gap, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Usually, so let me explain to you. So we had an interview before where I was trying to hire for a senior level, and then we got a manager who wanted to, switch back to an individual contributor, right? So he used to be he was a software engineer, but now he's looking for a software engineer job. And that gap is understandable. However, what makes it different is that I'm going to treat you then as a software engineer, which means I expect you to answer these just like any other software engineering candidates. And if you can't answer those, that means you've been far too removed from the software engineer portion. But just because you have a gap in your work experience or your career, it doesn't really mean that that's a bad thing. And again, if you can recall that experience and you've learned from that experience, and you have, very good examples of technical understanding or projects, and that has very good experiences for you to list, by all means, you should put that there. Even if it was an interview, even if it's a volunteer job, it doesn't matter. Anything that's gonna give you a chance to kind of like shine and show your skills. Because remember, the whole point of interview is like selling yourself, right? Why should we hire you as an engineer? Or not even that. Why should I hire you for the position you're applying, right? So you have to convince me the same way that I have to convince you why you should want to work for us, right? So it's a two-way conversation.
Okay. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I had another question in regards to the whole application process itself. So if I do end up getting an interview, and in the like I've had previously, so even when I have applied for the on-campus jobs and everything, I have had people ask me to explain my own projects and everything. So how important is it to have a live demo of your project with you? Because sometimes it's the case like the code was with on another laptop, and now it's not with me anymore. So is it fine if I'm able to explain it from like everything properly in a proper manner?
Just so you know, I've never had anyone like display anything as their actual code. Now, however, if you want to be a front-end engineer, what's also nice for you to have is have like a portfolio of the things you've done, explain what you've done, and then it could be like just the design look, it could be like, and then explain specifically the things in there, which is also great too. But I've never had to I never required a candidate to say, hey, I want to see some of your work, because to be honest, there's no way for me to know, like me being just strictly honest, that you wrote that code. Someone else could have written that for you, right? How I find out is by asking you questions, by understanding, by asking you specific questions. I can then tell what your level of experience is. How much did you work on a problem? Because let's be honest, if you worked on a problem and you really worked on that problem and you saw the challenge and did that, if I ask you specific questions on those things, you'll be able to answer that very deeply. Like I can tell the level of depth you went in order to solve that challenge. If you didn't, I can also tell, because it'll be very, very shallow. Hence why it's more important for you to include as much as you can remember of those things. So that's how that's where the quality comes to mind, right?
Okay. Yeah, I'm done with my questions.
Okay. So this should be a fairly simple. Explain recursion.
So from what I know, recursion is to basically reduce. I'm going to explain in a broad term. So why basically we use recursion is to reduce the line of codes in general, and to make the application faster, or your algorithm faster. So recursion is basically calling a particular function. So a function calls itself in order to minimize the calculations or computations which are to be done, so that your algorithm just starts to perform in a better way. So that is the basic overview of recursion from my understanding.
So the biggest thing that you got to make sure too is that if you don't do recursion properly, you end up with an infinite loop. So you got to remember you have
Mm-hmm.
that end state where you call itself over and over until you reach an end state so that you're breaking
Mm-hmm.
out and then all that stuff. But that's a good answer.
Okay. So if I'm asked this question, I need to mention the endpoint as well. Like there needs to be a condition
Yeah,
in between.
because or else if because just thinking basically, right? If a method just calls on itself, that ends up
Mm-hmm.
being an infinite loop, essentially, right? You got to
Yeah.
make sure that the point of recursion is that it calls on itself until it reaches end state, because that's the definition of recursion, right? Because it's not
Mm-hmm.
just calling itself, it's calling itself until it reaches an end state and then it resolves it, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. So since you talked about front end, how well versed are you with preventing client-side data manipulation? Have you worked with that before? No.
So to answer this question more accurately, I need to ask you one thing. So from client side manipulation, do you mean if the data which is being rendered to the website can be manipulated by the users?
Correct.
Okay. So I think the users can manipulate data if there is no strict mode to the application, and if you like go into the console and want to change something, I think that's pretty much doable for a lot of current websites as well. But unless and until I'm not exactly sure how the user itself can change the source code, so I'm not that familiar with how to prevent that, or because I'm not sure of the cause itself. So yeah, I mean that's what I
No,
would
that's
like to
fine.
say.
So just to give you a little background, there's multiple ways of people doing that. Like just modifying the client-side data. If you're the middleman, there's
Mm-hmm.
a very good way for you to do that, because then you can steal information between the two, right? But if you're the customer, it means that you have the capability of bypassing any safety protocols you've put in on the front end and trying to reach
Mm-hmm.
that to the database, right? So in order for you to prevent that, that's why a lot of as you learn in your career, is that it's not good enough just to have checks and validation in the front end. You want to
Yeah.
have both checks and validation in the front end and the back end, even if it's double the code and double the work. Why? Because the UI side only prevents people from interacting that. But if you get somebody who's an engineer or has basic understanding of how website works, you can easily, manipulate the form data to have whatever information you want, right? Because
Hmm.
it's just HTML. I can change that and submit that request to the back end like it's nothing,
Yeah.
right? And if the back end doesn't validate that, imagine the possibilities that happens. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of NoSQL injection, like SQL injection issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because people don't properly escape characters. So you can have stuff like that happen, where the user is interacting with the backend in a way that you did not expect them to, and in a way that you do not want them to. So that's why it's important.
Okay. So just to get some more clarity on this, are you saying that the users themselves can access the data by just changing a specific snippets of code from the front
Yeah.
end?
Think about it this way. So let's say you have a form, HTML
Mm-hmm.
form, right? And in that form, let's say you're registering for classes,
Mm-hmm.
right? But let's say the form only has specific classes for you to register for, right? And let's say it's just IDs, right? And IDs, as you know, are usually integers. Sometimes it's GUIDs, which is better. But if it's just
Mm-hmm.
integers, that means I can guess what the next ID could be, right? So nothing will prevent me from copying that form, but changing that form input field from an ID that is not listed, right?
Yeah.
And submitting that, allowing
Mm-hmm.
me to then submit information that was not presented on the form, that the UI had, made sure that that's the only thing I had access to, but it goes all the way to the back end, right? Think about it that
Mm-hmm.
way. So that's why it's important to understand those kind of like those challenges that you may encounter and how to prevent them.
Okay.
But again, this is based on a long career on doing these things. So don't feel bad that you may not know this, but it's just questions that I have here, so that way I can understand how you would answer them, and also test on your skill level.
Yeah, I'm gonna be very honest. This is like I'm looking at this from a huge learning experience perspective, because you're a very experienced developer and have been an employee for a long time. So I'm just trying to ask as much as I can and learn as much as I can.
No, that's good. Okay, so now let's flip it. So do you have any questions for me? It's part of the interview.
Yeah. So questions for you. Can I ask one question before actually answering this? Yeah. So when interviewers ask this, do you have any questions for me? Is this in regard to the job role or to the company itself?
It could be both.
Uh-huh. So like I can ask just basic questions like if the job role when it's gonna start, or how the next process of the interview is gonna be, or by when I can.
Usually, so it depends on when. So if you're in a technical interview, that's you want to keep it to the technical stuff, and you can ask like when you should expect the next process or the next step, and then they usually tell you, oh, we'll get in touch with you, and if we agree to moving you along forward, you will be talking to the next person, and then stuff like that. You don't need to ask about those things specifically, because if you are a candidate that they're going to push you forward, they'll reach out to you. What you want to ask about is more about the environment. One of the things that I like to do is that, you may not know this, but different companies they have different environments, meaning that some will have a QA department, they'll have testing, they have all these things. Others won't have any of that stuff. Now it's up to you to figure out, just because a company lacks that, does it mean that you wanna or not wanna work there? Yeah. So this is the part where you wanna truly ask questions if this is the place where you think you wanna work. Granted that it's being that you're trying to get into your first job, that's kind of hard to do because you just want to get a job, period, right? But as you get on with your career, you have to understand that not every job is the same. You will have to understand that your skill level may open a lot of doors, and it will, as you get more and more skills. And at that point, you have to be very conscious of like, where do you want to work? Because as a software engineer currently, and probably in the next couple of decades, if not longer, you will be very fortunate to know that there'll be a lot of positions out there, and you have to decide. Granted that the past recent global economy hasn't done good, and there's been a lot of layoffs, which means there's a lot more competition, but you will never hear that there is like a shortage of jobs. There's always a shortage of candidates, and when I say shortage of candidates, it's qualified candidates, right? And it's up to you to ensure that you grow your experience, your career, and your skill set in a way that it makes you more like that people want to hire you, right? So that's when it becomes important for you to decide between, if you have multiple interviews and let's say they all want to move forward to you and you'll get all offers, how do you decide which one you go for? You could go with the the time tested, the one that's going to pay me the most money. But as you go further on your career, you'll find out that the money is no longer that important, and actually the environment you're working with, the people you're working with, and sometimes even the job that you do. Are you helping people, or are you doing other things? That might actually strive you to pick a specific position over another. So you got to be very careful when you make those decisions.
Okay, how do I exactly go on asking about the environment? Because like I'm trying to think of a way to just ask like especially after technical interview. I don't think you're supposed to ask about the environment after a technical interview. Can you?
Ask about what?
Like the work environment and how it is to like.
Of course you can, because technical interview doesn't mean that it's just technical related. You could just ask, how do you work in agile? How big are your teams? Is it like and then you can even say, do you have like different time zones? Do you have teams in different time zones or whatnot? There's many questions about that you could ask. That's not technically related, but it's about the job, and it's about and the people who are in the technical interview are most qualified to answer that. Because the thing is, let's say if you're talking about to the manager, they may not know all of the non-technical portion of working the teams. They might be, because they might be the one hiring and they're hiring for that team. They could ask you those questions. But on the technical side, you can also say, hey, how much do you interact with other technologies or with other teams in other areas and stuff like that? Especially, like I said, if you do research in the company you're working with, you may know like what kind of technologies they're working in, and you may want to ask, hey, how how likely is it for you guys to actually implement this technology, or do you have this technology in-house already? So those are very good questions to ask, because that actually tells you that you're interested, and also tells you what actually makes you even more interested into working here. Because like I said, it's a two-way street. You're interviewing me as much as I'm interviewing you.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. I think there was another question in the back of my mind. Like when you give like for some companies, they have the tech stack as different when they as opposed to the tech stack they use in the interview. So for example, I can be giving an interview in Python, but the tech stack will be .NET and like C hash or something, right? So my question was like, should I ask them is there a possibility for a training period, or should I start learning these tech stacks? Which tech stack do you currently use so that I can develop my own side from it?
That's a good question. It depends, because funny enough, you say C hash, we call it C
C
sharp.
sharp, yeah.
But again, not a big deal. It depends, and it's kind of like a double-edged sword. When you're starting off, it's great for you to kind of like immerse yourself with different tech stacks. The only issue you find out is it's a lot of information.
Yeah.
The best thing I can tell you is find one that interests you the most. And then not only that, and if you don't have like, an internship or experience that people want, develop one yourself, create your own personal project. And in there, you can explain, since, I'm in school and I haven't been able to work or land a job, I've been working on a personal project of, creating, a web app for X and YZ, right? And then explain the choices you've made in that, and how you went about into getting to that. And some answers could be like, you know what, you just really understand Python, and you really understand React, and you really like it, and you wanted to see if you could create your own application for that. That shows initiative. That shows how to do. That's just as important as you doing any other experience. So being able to speak to the technology that you work with, that is very important. And if you show initiative, that even though you don't have a job, but you created your own personal project to work on it, and be able to talk to them about the challenges you faced, the things you did it, how'd you come up with ideas, stuff like that, also helps.
Okay. Yeah. I have a few more questions. Is it okay if I ask them? Because I don't want to go ahead of the time schedule if you have another interview as well.
No, it's fine.
Yeah. So I have one question which is related to the system design questions. So how often is it and do I get to know before the technical interview that the system design questions will be asked, or how often is the possibility that a system design question will be asked in general?
It depends. Sometimes you could ask that question on your first interview with the hiring manager. And again, each company is different, right? Sometimes the first person you talk to might be an HR person, and they may not know too much about it. You can still ask them, and then they can say, you know what, let me talk to the engineers, and then I'll get you an answer, right?
Okay.
So, and that shows initiative. So that's good. And then other stuff is that you could, do some research yourself on the company and see what kind of technology they say out there that they're using or they've used before and stuff like that, So it's always good to go into an interview with more information that they expect. You should do research on the company you're trying to interview for. Yes, it's a lot of work, and it might be wasted because they may not hire you, but it shows initiative, and it shows you that you've taken the time to kind of understand, like even just as little as like how they do business, what's more important for them as a company and stuff like that. It's good to know, because you can tailor your answers and your kind of like experience to that way even better, right? Because that way they're not just looking through lots of resumes and candidates about it, but they also are looking for very specific areas that they can actually hire for.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So my last question is it's related to more of on a resume basis. So if you have a better project than what you did in an internship, so is it advised to include that project over that internship? Because as you know, the resume is supposed to be a one page, right? So is it better to omit that work experience for that project? Or
let me stop you 1 second there. Yeah, resumes can be one page. It doesn't have to be.
Okay.
We've gone through resumes with multiple pages all the time. That's like, yes, I mean, granted that if you're just starting off and you have a multi-page resume, that might be overkill. But as your career gets longer and longer, you also want to trim some of the stuff. But again, you want to trim the stuff that's not related to the position. If you have a lot of experience related to that position, you want to put everything. But yeah, you want to have stuff that's more recent, obviously. But you also want to be able to speak about it, right? And it's important to have those things. You shouldn't just put in there just to put in there. Like the worst type of like faux pas that we've seen is like when you list every single language you worked on,
Yeah.
but like not just worked on, but studied and dabbled on stuff like that. That can get kind of like too much, right? I don't care if you know 30 different languages. I care if you know object-oriented languages, or more specifically Java, because that's what I'm hiring for, right? So those are the things. If you could put stuff that's related to or specific what they're asking for, that's what you want on your resume. And don't worry about this, if it's just 1 page or 2 page. You want to make it concise. You don't need to have like a huge essay in there, but you also want to put in everything that's pertinent. So if you have 2 or 3 pages worth of pertinent stuff, you want to put it there. If you don't put it there, because you don't need it to have just fluff. Because me reading, I'm going to be like, why did he include all this stuff? I just care about these areas, right? So you want to make sure that that's why it's important for you to tailor that, because it shows that you understand the company, you understand what they're looking for, and you're highlighting, because essentially the resume is your highlights of how you are qualified for the position and why you should be considered as a candidate for that position. So imagine that it's your highlights, right? So again, doesn't matter if it's personal project, doesn't matter if it's volunteer, doesn't matter if it's internship. The perfect experience is like, yes, you have professional experience with a specific technology or specific languages that you have. Sure that anything related to whatever they're asking for is good enough. More specifically, because you should be able to speak about it. It's more important that if I ask you questions about that project, you can go in depth. Remember, it's all about quality. So how deep can you go into those questions and those projects versus how shallow, right?
Okay.
That's more important.
Cool. Yeah, I mean that answers a lot of stuff for me. Yeah. So I think yeah, that's it. That's all the questions I have as of now. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I'm sorry I asked you a lot of questions.
Oh no. I mean, look, don't be sorry, because one of the things that why I wanted to do this is because when I went to school, I never had this. I walked into my first interview cold. I didn't even know. I just walked in there, and luckily they were hiring entry level, and one of my friends already worked there, so he put my name in there, because he actually sent an email blast saying like, hey, do you know any software engineers that are looking for a job? I'm like, I'm a software engineer looking for a job. I graduated. I'm about to graduate, help me out. And he's like, okay. And then I walked in there, and luckily, I got offered a job on the spot. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. It depends. Sometimes it takes multiple interviews. Sometimes it takes multiple times that you apply for. Don't get discouraged, because looking for a job is not easy. And you're gonna have to put in a lot of effort and work to do it, especially on these times now, because it's not like a lot of people have hiring freezes and stuff like that. So competition out there is fierce, but that doesn't mean that you can't land a job. And it may not be the perfect job, but it's a job, right? And specific for you, because I had coworkers that needed an H-1B visa, right? So it's harder still, but that's why you have to shine. And there are companies that will take a chance on you, but you got to make sure that you will work extra hard, because you now have something that other people don't have, which means you need that visa, right? And not a lot of companies have that. So that ecosystem is even more competitive. So you have to outshine other people doing that, because why should a company hire you when you require a visa, when I can find other candidates that don't, right? You have to show them that you are more than qualified and you do a better job than they will do, or just as qualified, so that way you're in the running and that you're worth the shot. So you got to make sure you do that.
Yeah. So like a follow-up to that, I just had one last question. While applying, how important is it, or how much does it matter if you have a referral to that company from an employee who already works there?
I mean, that sure helps, having that. It's not guaranteed either, though, because again, yeah, you could be referred to, because imagine in my side, right? I'm trying to find a candidate. How do I find a candidate? I have to just go to every job posting, everything like that, right? But if I have somebody who works within the company who has some relationship with another software engineer, chances are I won't have to vet that too much, right? But when I send it out in like Workday, Indeed, and all that stuff, I will get bombarded, right, with resumes. So I have to go through every single one of them and figure out which one is it worthwhile to do candidates. Sometimes if I have 100 candidates, I have to just whittle it down based on the resumes. If I have 10 candidates, I can maybe talk to them, 15, 30 minutes to see which ones I want to, push through to the technical interview. But it all depends on that. So that's why it's what's important too, though, is like it's not just important to just, apply for everything. It's also important for you to know what you're applying for and understanding that. And also showing that you have interest to join that company, and it wasn't just you put your resume everywhere just to get it, and that's why tailoring your resume specifically for that position is important. Learning a little bit about that company is important. Granted, it's a lot, so that's why take notes when you're applying. You apply to this job for this position, and this is the resume you have in there, just so you know what's out there, so that way when they reach out to you and ask you questions about it, you can answer them very well because you know what was there.
Yeah.
Sounds good?
Yep, sounds good. Sounds perfect. I mean, I've learned a lot. Thank you so much. That's all the questions I have from my side, for sure.
Okay, sounds good. Well, you did fairly well. Did you feel nervous at all?
Yeah, because I mean, I definitely felt nervous because I know for a fact that I'm not that technically prepared for interviews as of yet. I'm working on it right now, even as we talk. Like, because I think I got more focused on landing an internship rather than preparing for it in the past few months. So I am aware of where I'm lacking. And so I'm trying to work on that. And yeah, I was a bit nervous in that matter. So, but the thing is, I have a contingency for that, and I am trying to work on my. The thing is, it's not like I don't know where I'm going wrong. I know where I'm going wrong. So that's something that's giving me confidence. And about the whole interview in general, I really thought that this was a good learning experience for me. So, and
Oh,
plus I
that's
was
good.
excited. Yeah, I was like really excited for the interview itself because it's like, as I mentioned, it's my first one, and I really wanted to understand how it feels to be interviewed by someone who has like years and years of more experience than me. So yeah,
I mean, that's
that's
what's gonna be. So yeah, I mean, some nervousness is common, but remember, you've applied a lot in your education. You've worked hard in your experiences. Be proud of that. You may not be the perfect fit, but remember, your experiences are just as important. So it's good for you to know that and remember that, and you're applying this for a job, maybe even if it's out of your scope, even if it's a long shot, showing that you have initiative, showing that you're passionate does help, because it's not good enough just being a software engineer or knowing how to answer these technical questions. It's also how well are you actually going to interact with the team, because each team and each company have kind of like an atmosphere, right? And it's up to you also to decide and also ask questions so that you know if this is the place you want to actually work for too. It goes both ways. Again, I get it. First job is hard because you just want to land a job that's going to get you a visa and all that stuff. Understandable. But as you grow in your career, remember that. And also remember that everything is negotiable. You should ask questions, and this will be more literal impact when you get further down your future in your career. But salary is not everything. Benefits also help. PTO also helps. You can actually negotiate for PTO, something that I learned way later that I didn't know about. And that's important to you because let's say you have 10 or 15 years experience and you happen to go to a new job, and most companies, they start you off with the basic 1 or 2 weeks, right? But if you have that much experience, you'd be like, I don't want to come in with 2 weeks. And there's nothing wrong with asking, I want to have 3 to 4 weeks. The negotiation is not just about salary. It's about anything and everything that you want to ask about and ask them. And the answer could be no, but the answer could also be yes. And you may not know that if you don't ask. So that's what's important. Sometimes it could be like, oh, you're looking for a position that's X, but they provide you with Y, which is lower. And then you tell them, okay, so if you provide me Y, can you give me more PTO instead? Kind of have that negotiation going on, because sometimes they could be more open to that.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, do you have any more questions?
No, I'm just glad that I had this experience with you for sure. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, so you have my contact information. So if you ever have any questions in the future, anything like that, feel free to reach out. Okay.
Yeah, I'll definitely be in touch, and I'll let you know how my job hunt goes as well.
Good luck.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
See you
Have a
later.
good day.
You're
Bye-bye.
welcome. Bye.